So today I am reading chapter 3, where we meet the midwife. Or we've already met her, but if we learned everything we did about the cat and their interactions in chapter 2. And now we're going to learn about the midwife and the interactions. Before I start, I'd like to look back at the beginning. One thing that I didn't mention again, and I do whenever we read a new novel, is from which narrative point of view the story is told. And I've always found that it's easiest to identify that if you just take a peek at the first page. And it says, the first page in this book is the dung heap, and it says, when animal droppings and garbage and spoiled straw are piled up in a great heap, rotting and moiling give forth heat. And I just kind of scroll down till I see where there's either he or she or I, right? Just to see, as long as there's no dialogue, we can identify. In any event, the dung heap probably smelled little worse than everything else in her life. Oh, but the girl noticed, and on that frosty night burrowed deep in the warm, rotting muck, heedless of the smell. She slept in when she could, her own unwashed, unnourished, unloved. This is a description of the main character. That usually happens, like I said, when the characters are introduced during the exposition. And so as long as the narrator is standing outside of the story and telling it from the third person point of view, we can tell, because the narrator uses such words as she or beetle, brat, the midwife's apprentice. And so the only other thing we need to figure out once we know that it's third person is if it's third person limited or third person all knowing narrator. So does the narrator tell us the thoughts of more than just Brat? And I want to pay attention to that as I read chapter 3. We need to basically see if the narrator can tell us any thoughts from either the midwife or other characters in the book. Chapter 3, the midwife. Her name was Jane. She was known in the village as Jane the midwife because of her sharp nose and sharp glance. Beetle always thought of her as Jane Sharp. Jane Sharp became a midwife because she had given birth to 6 children, although none of them lived, went Sundays to Mass, and had strong hands and clean fingernails. She did her job with energy and some skill, but without care, compassion, or joy. She was the only midwife in the village. Taking Beetle gave her cheap labor and an apprentice too stupid and I need to look and see what that word actually is, since I typed this so that you could read it. Too and scared. Too stupid and scared. Okay. Taking Beetle gave her cheap labor and an apprentice too stupid and cared to be any competition. So this is telling us that she didn't like competition. And it says this suited the midwife. So right here, we're being told how the midwife feels. And we're given a picture of, the type of person that the midwife is and what her thinking is, the fact that this suits her. So this is showing that this is an omniscient narrator. We'll read a little bit more, but it's all knowing. The narrator knows about more than just Brat's thoughts. Beetle slept on the cottage floor and ate 2 meals a day of onions, turnips, dried apples, cheese, bread, and occasional bits of bacon. This suited Beetle. And so Beetle remained the midwife's apprentice as spring drew near and new green shoots appeared under the bare branches of shrubs and trees, and the villagers began plowing the muddy fields for the summer crops. Here's more setting. And that'll happen all throughout a novel. Even though it's introduced in the beginning, we get to know a little bit more about the setting, so we can tell that the season is changing. Beetle sometimes feared Jane Sharp was a witch, for she mumbled to herself, and once a pail of milk curdled as she passed. But mostly she knew Jane was what she first appeared, a woman neither young nor old, neither fat nor thin, with a sharp nose and a sharp glance and a wimple starched into sharp pleats. Each morning Beetle started the fire, blowing on the night's embers to encourage them to light the new day's scraps. She swept the cottage's earth floor, sprinkled it with water, and stamped it to keep it hard packed. She roasted the bacon and washed the mugs and knives and sprinkled fleabane about to keep the fleas down. She dusted the shelves packed with lugs and flasks and leather bottles of dragon dung and mouse ears, frog liver and ashes of toad, snail jelly, borage leaves, nettle juice, and the powdered bark of the blade alder tree. So these are all things that were thought to help a mother's labor. Um, they were midwife's medicines. In the afternoon, Beetle left the village for the woods, where she gathered honey, trapped birds, and collected herbs, leeches, and spiders' webs, and the cat went with her. When they were called, she accompanied the midwife to any cottage where a woman labored to birth her baby, provided that woman could pay a silver penny or a length of newly woven cloth or the best layer in the hen house. Beetle carried the basket with the clean linen, ragwort and columbine seeds to speed the birth, cobwebs for staunching blood, bryony and woolly nightshade to cleanse and comfort the mother, goat's beard to bring forth her milk, and sage tea for too much, jasper stone as a charm against misfortune, and mistletoe and elder leaves against witches. Beetle waited outside while the midwife did her magic within. The first time they were called to a cottage, Beetle vied to go in, but Jane slapped her, calling her clodpole and shallow-brained whiffer, and made her stay outside where she wouldn't get in the way. Often she called Beetle in when it was over to clean out the soiled straw bed and wash the linen, while Jane Sharp and the new mother sipped feverfew and nutmeg brewed in hot ale. And once she sent the girl back to the cottage to brew some black currant syrup to fight a new mother's fever. Beetle began to think perhaps she was kept out not because she was stupid, but to keep her in ignorance of the midwife's skills and spells. And she was right. So the fact that the narrator tells us, and she was right, that wouldn't happen if it wasn't an omniscient narrator to tell us other people's thoughts. They would, limited narrator, a first person limited, only focuses on the main character and only gives you information about the main character and through her thoughts. As the weather warmed and the villagers began digging long furrows in the field to take the seed, Beetle found herself doing more and more of the collecting and stewing and brewing, while Jane Sharp spent her time haggling over her fees. Twice the midwife refused to come to laboring mothers who had nothing to pay, and so the unfortunate woman had to bring forth their babies with none but the neighbor to help. That's awful. That tells us um, there's characterization there. It's painting a picture of the midwife for us. So the fact that she allowed mothers to have their babies without her because they had nothing to give her, that just shows what kind of a human she is. The midwife's greed angered the villagers, but they needed her, and so took out their anger not on Jane Sharp, but on her apprentice, needed by no one. Beetle endured their anger and their taunts in silence, and complained only to the cat, who listened and sometimes rubbed his head on her leg in sympathy. When spring arrived with soft breezes and meadows grown green, the villagers began sowing early peas and barley. followed by the village boys who threw stones at the hungry birds trying to eat the seed. Jack and Watt threw stones too at Beetle and the cat who followed her, which made the villagers laugh. Beetle was only the midwife's stupid apprentice, and no care to them. And there's more characterization that shows that those boys are terrible little humans. Those who abuse animals are the worst. One morning, not too long before May Day, Rate the Weaver's daughter lay down in the field and declared her baby was coming right there and then. Her father, Robert Weaver, and her husband, Thomas the Stutterer, tried to carry her back to their cottage, but she screamed and threw her arms about. There was nothing to do but mound up some clean straw for a bed and bring the midwife out to the field. Jane Sharp looked at the girl, settled the fee with Thomas, and rolled up her sleeves. She sent Beetle back to the cottage to pack a basket of necessaries. And don't drop or forget anything, you with the brain of a chicken. And don't dawdle. Beetle grabbed bottles off the shelf and bunches of dried herbs from the ceiling beam, surprised at how much she knew, how she could recognize the syrups and powders and ointments and herbs from their look and their smell, since the midwife could not write to make labels, and Beetle would not have been able to read them if she could. Kate was laboring in the field, not at plowing or sowing or weeding, but at making a way for her baby into the world. As Beetle watched, Jane moved Kate up on her knees and shouted, "Push, you cow! If an animal can do it, you can do it!" And Kate pushed. As Jane the midwife eased the child out of his mother and into her hands. It put Beetle in a mind of a time she got the cat out of the bag. And she temporarily forgave the midwife her sharpness, for her magic of her spells, and the miracle of her skills. After that, Beetle took to watching through the windows when the midwife was called. In that way, she learned that midwifery was as much about hard work and good sense as comfrey tonic, and comfrey tonic as spells and magic.